So welcome everybody. My name is Michael Poore. I'm a graduate student here at the UCSD School of Global Policy and Strategy. I'm also a board member on the student-led Strategic Studies Group, which is sponsoring this event today in conjunction with the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. So before we get into intros and everything, just a kind of quick overview of the format. We're going to be doing a fireside chat style discussion amongst myself and the other attendees. We'll do that for about the first half to 2/3 of the hour, and then we'll leave the last 15 to 20 minutes for a Q&A from the audience. So we'd absolutely love to have your participation, so please feel free at any point to type in questions down in that Q&A box below. So without further ado, introductions. So my co-host today is our very own Renee Bowen. Renee, as most of you probably know, is the director at the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy. She's also jointly appointed as a professor at GPS, as well as within the Department of Economics. Renee's got quite a lengthy resume, so I'll just list a few main points that I think are of value to today's discussions. She's a member of the California Governor's Council of Economic Advisors. She's also a member of the Council on Foreign Affairs, and she's also a faculty research fellow at the National Bureau of Economic Research. And then special guest today, who's actually a friend and old classmate of mine, Michael Greenwald, who has since gone on to a very interesting and successful career. Michael also has somewhat of a lengthy resume, so I'll try to keep it succinct. Michael spent a decent amount of time at the US Treasury. He was the US Treasury attaché to Qatar and Kuwait. He is currently a managing director at Tiedemann Advisors, which is a wealth advisory firm. He's also a senior advisor at the Atlantic Council, and he's a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs. So welcome, Michael. Today's discussion will focus on a report Michael recently published through the Atlantic Council, which is titled "The Future of the US Dollar, Weaponizing the US Financial System," and hopefully a good amount of you had a chance to go over that. It's a very interesting report. So Renee, why don't I kick it over to you at this point?
Thanks, Michael. Thanks for that great introduction. I'm very happy to be here. And Michael, thank you, Michael Greenwald. Thank you so much for joining us to discuss this very interesting report. So Michael has asked that we sort of allow him to tell a personal anecdote. I'm very anxious to hear it. That gives a little background to what we're going to talk about today. Michael, why don't you go ahead?
Sure. Thank you, Renee, and thank you, Michael, and thank you so much for having me today. I wish I was with all of you on campus, so I look forward to post-COVID coming back and being with all of you. So I spent over a decade working at Treasury going after terrorist money. And like many of you who are thinking about next steps at inflection points, I want to just give you a brief anecdote of why I went to work at Treasury to go after terrorist financing and what really drew my career up to this point. So I want to take you back to September 9th, 2001. It happened to be my birthday. The setting was Chestnut Hill, Massachusetts, and it was a Sunday evening. And many in the Jewish community on Sundays, it's Chinese food night. And we were at a local Chinese restaurant with my parents, and the table next had close family friends, the Ross family, and he was a travel agent, and he was flying to LA on Tuesday. And he used to always say that he missed his flights always, even though he was a travel agent. So that Tuesday was September 11th, 2001. And I was at St. Mark's. Michael and I were classmates at St. Mark's in Southborough, Massachusetts. And I was at St. Mark's that Tuesday morning taking a math test. And a teacher came in and told us to go to the chapel because there had been an incident. And Richard Ross, my father's best friend, had made the flight, the first plane, the American Airlines flight, and he got upgraded to first class, and he sat next to the lead al-Qaeda hijacker, Mohammed Atta. And 15 minutes into the flight, Mohammed Atta took out his box cutters, slit his throat, took over the first class cabin, and the first plane went into the towers. Later that evening, I went with my dad over to his son's home to mourn his life. And like many of us during that time, we were watching wall-to-wall coverage. The following year, I went to college in Washington, D.C. at GW. And in the coming years, the 9/11 Commission report would come out. And there was an anecdote to that report about how the attacks of 9/11 were financed. Al-Qaeda moving $500,000 into the United States to finance 9/11. Well, I must have read that report 20 times. And I knew that I wanted to go work for the unit, the Office of Terrorism and Financial Intelligence at Treasury, to go after Al-Qaeda's money. And that led me on my journey. So Renee, Michael, happy to begin the conversation.
Michael, thanks for sharing that very personal story. I cannot hear about 9/11 without getting chills, as I myself was in New York City at the time, Midtown Manhattan, JP Morgan, a very tall building. And I certainly remember the moment those planes hit the towers. That's a really powerful story. And I think that will help our audience really put things in context. So I'd like to start reflecting a little bit on this report. I might even start with the title, which is, it says weaponizing the US financial system. Certainly that makes a lot more sense in the context of the story that you just told. But I'd also like to get a sense of what that really means to you. So clearly, we've been experiencing some challenges to global economic integration, but the world still remains very interconnected, whether it's through trade, through finance, and other means. So your report is really sort of focused on the fact that the US dollar is the global reserve currency. And what does that mean for the United States? What does that mean for the world? And in particular, what might that mean for the United States' ability to curb terrorism or curb other nefarious actors? So can you tell us, in your words, what this really implies? And do you think this is good for the United States? What are sort of the trade-offs involved as we're thinking about the currency as a weapon versus the currency as an economic tool?
So thank you, Renee, for the question, and thank you for sharing your where you were that day. What I would say is that after 9/11, the United States went to war on many fronts. And the most effective front, besides the military, and besides what came later with drone strikes and now our cyber tools that we use, is the financial front. And the tip of the spear in that campaign was the dollar and is the US financial system. And so what does that mean? I'll break it down. It means that after 9/11, the United States used sanctions and targeted economic tools to first go after the Al-Qaeda organization, any Al-Qaeda operatives or individuals that were providing material support, money, financing, other forms of material support, which is a broad definition. And they were sanctioned under US authorities. And there was a terrorism executive order that came out, the Bush administration signed very soon after 9/11. And it was an executive order EO 13224. And I only remember that exact number is because we at Treasury have utilized it so many times with sanctions. It's the terrorism executive order. It's a very broad executive order that goes after Al-Qaeda, its affiliates, and it's been used in years later to go after other terrorist organizations that pose a national security threat to the United States. So Renee, it first got used to go after Al-Qaeda in any of its operatives. We use it against Hezbollah, Boko Haram, as Al-Qaeda broke out offshoot-wise to other organizations for Al-Qaeda in Africa or the Arabian Peninsula or in Egypt or in Pakistan. It became more fragmented. And so we had to continue to use these authorities. Where the dollar and the US financial sector really came into, I think, fruition and into play was against Iran. And the argument that Stuart Levy, the first undersecretary at Treasury for this issue and my first boss, he would go to Europe and he would go to the banks, he would go to companies, and he would say, you have a very clear choice in front of you. You can either bank with the United States, have a correspondent relationship that runs through New York, or you can be cut off. And that was the choice for Europeans and for others around the world. And it was a very effective tool, and getting Europe on board against Iran was effective and ultimately brought us to the deal under the Obama administration. And that will be the attempt now under the new administration to do that. And then we can talk about Russia and how that's evolved. But I would say, Renee, that the United States, when it goes into the Situation Room now and it meets with the president and his advisors about the options in front of them, the dollar is so at that table because the choice before us is not to use military means. It's how can we make this conflict go away first by economic means and then ratcheting up the pressure on the escalation ladder. To your point about whether this is good, it's good when it's targeted. It's good when it's scalpel-like. When it gets blurry and we add certain trade concerns into the weaponization process that is not targeted and it's outside of a mission, then it gets fuzzy. So I would say targeted scalpel-like actions backed up by evidence, backed up by clarity, and that's well coordinated with Europeans or other allies, that is the most effective approach.
Thanks, Michael. That was a really fascinating answer, and I think I even learned a lot just in those few minutes. I know my co-host Michael has some questions too, but I'd like to follow up a little bit. So one thing I'd like to ask is, from your perspective, were these financial sanctions effective in the case of Al-Qaeda? So that's the first question. And one of the primary considerations, I'd imagine, is having these organizations being somewhat cash strapped, right? And I imagine that would be an effective tool in such an organization. But how might this translate into other means, or trying to discipline other actors who might have significantly more resources? Do you see this as a tool that we can effectively use today?
That's a great question. And it really depends on the organization, how tied they are to the formal financial sector. When I say formal, the banks. I think the way you have to view terrorist organizations like Al-Qaeda, like Hezbollah, and then others like Iran and North Korea, is that they are businesses. Al-Qaeda is a business. So Al-Qaeda's got revenues, they've got their support, how do they raise money? They've got health care for their suicide bombers and their families. They're incentivizing the fighters to join the ranks. And we can get to ISIS, which has been very effective in previous years on raising money and paying its fighters. So for Al-Qaeda, many of them did not have bank accounts in the United States. So sanctions against Al-Qaeda are important, and they're important if they have ties overseas, but most of them are, I would say, some are symbolic and some are coordinated well with other countries given they cross borders, so Turkey and other countries where there would be nexus points. Whereas an organization like Hezbollah, which is truly a bureaucratic organization, there is more chance to have Lebanese bank accounts here in the United States. In the case of Russia, the oligarchs and others not being able to travel or not being able to have accounts here or they own real estate here, that's a barrier to entry. So it really depends upon what their linkages are to the US, to Europe, and others. They were effective, and I think that there were charities. Al-Qaeda used to raise money through a charity network of actually chocolate companies under bin Laden. And there are charities that the United States has shut down that had a double-edged sword purpose. Now, prosecuting a charity is very difficult. And the United States found that days after 9/11, and as the years grew, it became very difficult to wage a case against charities. But there were certain cases in the United States, so like the Holy Land Foundation, for example, out of Texas, that was a case the United States brought. But I would say the more effective nature has been against Iran and Russia in larger states that have a connection to the US sector. Naming and shaming members of Al-Qaeda is very effective to making sure they can't crisscross other countries out of US jurisdiction.
Thanks so much. I'm going to turn it to Michael for a question.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. So thank you, Renee. So kind of maybe just taking a few steps back, Michael, and for those, in the audience that may not be very familiar with the, sort of the finance and the financial system, when we're talking about the dollar as the global reserve currency and the sort of, I believe the term is exorbitant privilege that provides for the U.S. And then tying that into, when you're talking about negotiations in Europe and you're sort of presenting this offer, either, continue to have access to our banking or be choked off. What does that, what does that mean? What's to say, why can't those actors or those nations just say, okay, yeah, fine, we don't need to bank with you? Could you just kind of dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, no, great question. Banking with the United States and being the global reserve leader, it's a great economic and trade privilege for other countries and their banks and their institutions. And so being the global reserve leader also, whenever you're the leader, everyone's trying to go after you and trying to go around you. And that we can get to that with China, and I see questions coming up about crypto and other forms. What I would say, Michael, is that if a European bank can't bank with the United States, they are really blacklisted from the world. So there was instances where the Treasury under the Patriot Act has authority called Section 311 of the Patriot Act. And that is an economic nuclear bomb because that labels a bank or a jurisdiction or a country a primary money laundering concern. And so if the United States determines a Section 311, let's say on a bank in a European country, kryptonite. absolute kryptonite because it cuts them off from the US and then they're radioactive. So no one wants to deal with that bank because they become a bad bank. And if they touch that bad bank, they can become sanctioned from the United States. Now, I use that example because the power is so great. Having that power of the dollar and the power of the US sector, it has to be done very carefully so that when we do roll out something like that, it needs to be well backed up, well resourced. Usually there's tons of coordination between the United States, State Department, your allies, the country itself to change behavior. Because the goal here is to change behavior and to modify. So I won't name which institution I'm referring to, but in that instance, we named them a primary money laundering concern under Section 311. The next day, we got a call from the foreign minister of that country, and they were coming to Washington. They were meeting with Treasury leadership. They wanted to learn, okay, we understand there's a problem. Who is it? What do we have to do to not be in this mess? And so very quickly, there was X, Y, and Z person at this bank who was a problem. They got ousted, new management in place, new protocols, no Section 311. So the goal here is to change behavior. It doesn't always work. We can get to Russia. It didn't change Putin's calculus. They're still in Crimea, but that's the goal of sanctions, is for them not to be there forever, is for us to use it in a very targeted, and I use the word scalpel because the tools should be very specific.
Thanks, Michael. So that sort of raises a question for me. So clearly, again, with global tensions at an all-time high, and the U.S. is being really scrutinized right now for its role over the last few years and potential interference in other countries. So I want to ask you, what are the risks to the U.S. standing if we think about throwing around or weight in terms of financial sanctions or currency actions?
Well, I think that there are certainly risks when we become complacent, when we become overconfident, and we do not remain proactive, agile, and well coordinated with our allies. And so there's a lot of, I would say, there's been a lot of talk about the US dollar being overtaken. And economists on both sides of the aisle have tried to predict this for years. And so I do think there is major hyperbole when it comes to this. But where I think we're heading, Renee, is that China is actively made it a policy of its central bank and its organizations to go around the dollar. And so what does that mean? It means that China has created a digital currency on its own. It's got its Belt and Road Initiative, which I will say, though, is in dollars, which is significant. So once the Belt and Road is no longer in dollars, that will be important to watch and a trigger. But China's trying to create a roadmap for other countries to not deal with the United States in US dollars, but to deal in alternative currencies. Now, you would need the euro to go towards more of China, and you in OPEC, which is currently based on the dollar. If both of those switched, which is a big if, it would have an impact. But I think where we're ultimately headed at some point, if there is a tipping point, is a basket of currencies approach. So Kuwait, for example, is like 92% to the dollar, but they have the optionality to use other currencies. And so I think, Renee, it's the United States, when it gets involved economically, should use its power. It should call out China for unfair trade practices. It should, label Huawei and others and ZTE issues, and it should use its economic might. But it's more effective if Janet Yellen and Christine Lagarde are armed together with that script going to Beijing. That's when it's really effective. And I think what we can't lose sight of is that China, could overtake the United States as the world's largest economy much earlier than expected. And so we have to be laser focused on how to be even more creative with our economic tools.
Great, thanks so much. I'm going to hand it over to Michael for another question. And it seems quite related to this China issue.
Yes, so Michael, I'm glad you touched on China, and the report is heavily focused on China, which is great here for GPS. We're very focused on Asia Pacific. So there's a lot of folks that are dedicating their studies directly to China. So kind of an add-on to that question, this was in the report. China is the second largest foreign holder of U.S. treasuries, U.S. debt. What sort of influence does that afford them? And then, in addition to that, how does that complicate, potential sanctions policy or using the dollar to resist China or against China?
Yeah, I mean, it's a vulnerability for the United States, and but it's been part of our economic processes under both administrations. So I think that China is well aware of this strength. It hasn't yielded it yet. When it was tested under the previous administration, it hasn't been using that as a true threat yet. And so we've got some unique case studies to look at. China needs the United States. The United States needs China. We should cooperate with China on very specific instances. We should go in clear-eyed. And so if we're going to have cooperation on climate, for example, it needs to be well coordinated on what our Huawei and ZTE policy is as well. And what does that mean for 5G? So it's a very complicated problem set. I would say, Michael, that the whole idea of decoupling is just not realistic. And so I think that the new Secretary of State has acknowledged that. I think China has breathed a sigh of relief because China doesn't want to hurt itself. And the United States needs to be very targeted with China where it doesn't hurt its own economy. And so, unlike Russia, which isn't as connected to the United States, but even in that case study, when the United States was wielding sanctions against its banks and its oligarchs and others, a case study that we're trying to use for the China playbook on sanctions, it needs to be very targeted so there's not economic impact, not just against the United States, but against Europe. And so I would say it's a very delicate balance of how much China wants to weaponize its economic power and how much the United States wants to weaponize its power. I think weaponize in this term is a bit hawkish. I think that the term of art between the US and China should be targeted objectives of economic power, because we can weaponize against terrorist organizations, we can weaponize against Iran. With China, I think this administration will probably take it a notch downwards from the temperature of the last administration, but the tone may be different, but the actions may be similar, and they may still keep many of the actions under the last administration.
Thanks, Michael. So this also goes nicely into my next question for you. You've said a bit of this already. So if you had to discuss 3 priorities for the Biden administration in terms of financial sanctions, what would you list as those 3 priorities?
Well, many of my friends who are back at Treasury going into the administration, and they've got a great team. Treasury is a special place. I hold a special place in my heart. They're doing a full review of sanctions right now, which ones are effective, which ones aren't. The thing about sanctions, Renee, is that once you enact the sanctions, that's just the beginning. You have to constantly monitor the impact and whether there's evasion during those sanctions. So I think the new administration will certainly prioritize what sanctions can remain on Iran, but which sanctions can be negotiated without going into the terrorism category. That's going to be a fine balance. I think ultimately on China, they're probably taking a close look at 5G, Huawei, and ZTE, and also on the cyber-related sanctions and trying to figure out which bucket can be truly targeted. And then I think with regards to Russia, there's been several areas where election interference may play a role. And so I think cyber will likely, there's a cyber executive order that hasn't been used that very much from Treasury. And so I could see them going into that. But I would add on that digital currencies and creating an important conversation with the EU and central banks on digital currencies, what that means, how it can be used, what are the guidelines. There was a guidance late in the last administration on this issue. And so I expect Treasury Secretary Yellen and Christine Lagarde to have staff level working groups on this. And then I expect other Fed governors in the United States to likely push for more clarity on this topic.
Thanks so much. Michael, I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, so you touched on what I think is, somewhat the elephant in the room is digital currencies. And Renee, you and I spoke about this beforehand. That's I think there's obviously a ton of media hype around it right now. You've got Bitcoin through the ceiling, and I think I know you've got some large corporate execs of large commercial banks are now reversing course and saying, yes, this is a serious thing we need to look at. And then globally, you've got China investing a lot of time and money into digitized central currency. Where are we with that in terms of how much do we, as the U.S., need to be really focusing on that? How ahead or behind are we? What's your sort of general take in that space?
Sure. Well, I think it's a volatile space, regardless how you look at it. It's been inconsistent. Just by, as you mentioned, executives at institutions have switched their tune, right? It began as a fad, and then now it's become more formalized. China only turned to the digital currency space because its own currency has stalled since 2010. So its central bank and its economists huddled and said, we've got a problem because the United States has the dollar. We're growing our military. We've got our own economic plan. How do we go around the United States dollar? How do we match the United States economically? let's try to take away this notch in the United States economic belt. And so that's why China has been rolling it out, going to use it for its Olympics. WeChat has been using it like no other, and it's becoming formalized in China. And they're hopeful to get other countries in Africa and in Europe on board. Here in the United States, Michael, we are behind, but we don't need to be. As the global reserve leader, as you know, many of our payment systems are digital currently. Now, there was discussion when COVID hit about digital payments being able to send stimulus checks faster to people's homes, and that's driven a discussion. So I think that the United States should play a leadership role with the major central banks around the world to see how it can be a safe but transparent system that has anti-money laundering and the financing of terrorism controls built in, to provide clarity to the financial sector. And then you've got Libra, you've got Facebook, financial and wallet, and you've got all these different companies coming about. And you've got people investing in this space without having really much knowledge. So I think ultimately, I don't take it truly serious until central banks take it serious. So once central bank governors start to be regulating a digital currency, that is the signal that it's become more formalized. Now, the Bank of England, the Bank of, in Singapore, in the UAE, and others in Europe, they have said they're going to roll this out in the next couple of years. They're still studying it. So what I would recommend is U.S. as the global reserve leader play a leadership role, and that's Jay Powell and his counterparts to come together and ultimately be mindful of what China's doing, but be proactive. Don't just admire the problem. And I see there's many questions in the chat about this, but so I'll stop there.
Renee, I'll pass it back to you.
Okay, great. So before we get to the questions in the chat, which we're anxious to get to, there's some really fascinating questions there. Michael, I'd just like you to speak briefly on what sort of advice you might give students in the audience who might be interested in a field like you've pursued.
Sure, thanks, Renee. I began with that personal story because passion drew me to working in the government, working truly on an issue that was nonpartisan, right? The votes in Congress on going after terrorist money is pretty universal. And so for me, it was working on an issue that was larger than myself. And so I started with the basis that I wanted to take a step and play a role and live a life of consequence. And for me, it was under that narrative, and that passion pushed me there. Ultimately, working with good teams and good people and having mentors, that's been the most important thing. I try to keep in touch with everyone that paid it forward to me because I'm grateful. And so my best advice to all of you is take an extra 10 minutes a day and write a note to someone that helped you or reach out to someone, because ultimately I am where I am today because of the small things. I had a friend that was working at Treasury under Hank Paulson on China, and I really wanted to get into Treasury. I was an eager beaver getting in there. And the guy said to me, meet me on a Tuesday at 3:10 at this coffee shop. I've got 10 minutes. We have a planned fire drill. I've got 10 minutes for you. I took my 10 minutes seriously, got an interview, and I got the job. So my mindset always was, if I can get the interview, I can get the job. And so be confident, be humble, but continue to reach out to everyone around you because you never know.
Excellent advice. Sounds like the kind of advice I give my students. Great. So we have a bit of time for questions, and I would, very challenging questions here, and we're not going to hold back. So I'm going to start with Perry Bloom. And Perry writes, doesn't the use of the US currency, or more generally, the US financial system as a weapon incentivize both the targets of the weapon or non-participant observers to develop alternatives like these cryptocurrencies?
Perry, great question. It does. And so, the reason why I wrote this piece was to prevent ultimately, areas to go around the US dollar. There's always going to be schemes and other ways to go around the dollar. But my goal with writing this is to keep the dollar as a key force in US foreign policy. And so it does incentivize unless we use it very targeted. And so if we overuse the power, our adversaries have become experts at how to deal with the dollar, how to convert to other currencies. And so we have to be agile, and we have to also, now that digital currencies are really coming to fruition, the Treasury and others need to have public-private working groups to have that ongoing conversation so we don't push these initiatives underground. And that's going to be a true delicate balance, is how do you maintain the power of the dollar, but also respect what the others are doing that are not operating in the dollar.
Thanks for that response. So a related question. So you mentioned, you cited as an example of effectiveness, the sanctions on Iran. And the question from Perry Bloom says, aren't the true ramifications regressive in that the majority of the impact falls on the average Iranian citizen and not on the leadership who have means to avoid or circumvent the most serious consequences?
Well, I would disagree, Perry. I would say that Iran is a smart, strategic adversary and enemy, and they are using their coffers, and many of the organizations in there are part of their military wing in the IRGC, and they have the power to deplete the coffers of their people and to take money from the public to use for other goods. And they've done that. And there's been reporting over many years about the Iranians have done that. The actions against Iran have been very specific. They've gone after banks, airlines, other companies that are direct, they get the direct funding from the terrorism and military wings of Iran. Our goal is not to hurt the average Iranian. We want to work with the average Iranian. Many Iranians want to work with the United States, and many Iranians live in the United States. But so we try through these actions to be very targeted. Now, Iran can use that and use propaganda to showcase that we're hurting the Iranian people. Now, ultimately, sanctions do have some effects that hurt the overall macro economy. And yes, that can hurt the investment climate in Iran. But until Iran changes course and is not funding Hezbollah, IRGC, and other actors, sanctions on Iran should not go away. And so even if this administration is successful navigating non-proliferation with Iran, dealing with their terrorism arms is a whole other negotiation that will take a long time to come together.
Thanks, Michael. So a couple more questions, somewhat related. Fred asked two, and I'll lump them together. Number one, what are the primary sources of capital for major terrorist organizations? Is it countries, individuals, or unknown? And his second question is related to cryptocurrencies. And you mentioned it's often treated as a fad. But many serious technologists state with equivocation it will happen. Do we wait to engage or get out in front? And I know you mentioned you're waiting to some extent, but I do want to echo this serious technologist state with equivocation, that they really do believe these cryptocurrencies will eventually take over. So I will confess I have my own skepticism of this, and I've seen some of these technologists, and it's more of a religion to them, it seems, some of them. But it's true that some very notable people have said this.
Well, let me take this part first. I'm not here to demonize digital currencies. I think that there are great attributes, most importantly, financial inclusion, and being able to have a cheap way of transferring money, and doing that in a transparent and healthy way is beneficial to all. Where I am caught up is being able to have enough anti-money laundering, terrorist financing controls built in at every level. And so, since 9/11, the formal financial sector, the banks, are very well controlled, and they're very well set up to prevent against terrorists moving money through banks. What becomes more difficult, and going to your other question about the sources of capital, is terrorists like ISIS, like Al-Qaeda, moving money outside of banks, moving money through Hawala, moving money through couriers, through criminals. So the sources of funding are really funding that's been all throughout the years in the wild, wild west. Bank robberies, drugs, kidnapping for ransoms, a huge source of capital for Al-Qaeda and for ISIS, and was an issue that I focused on for many years, and is a problem that we had with the Europeans, to name a few, with regards to paying ransoms, which is a highly sensitive issue. But really, I would say that countries like Iran and organizations like Al-Qaeda, different financing sources, right? So Iran is backed by a state. They're state sponsored. And so they will fund Hezbollah in Lebanon. Whereas Al-Qaeda gets sources of funding from different sources. ISIS got it from oil, or from kidnapping, or from bank robberies, or antiquities, which is an issue that is of growing importance as the art market in antiquities continues to shift and get more regulation as we see schemes come out. So I would say that digital currencies, yes, are here to stay. And yes, the United States should be proactive and should not be admiring them. But we need to be cautious, and we need to not rush this. And so I think it demands a lot of study, because it is very disruptive. And I do think you need economists and technologists in the same room, even though they're speaking the same language. Get some whiteboards together and work together to make sure that there are proper controls in place.
Great. Well, we've got some whiteboards right here, so no need to go very far. So we have a few minutes left. I'd like to give you some time for closing remarks. I'd also like to give some time to Michael in case he has any final questions. But we do have an interesting question from Diana Lady Dugan, a good friend of yours and mine. And she is concerned again about how fast we may or may not move on this issue of digital currencies. So her question is, arguably increasing dominant in consumer spending internationally, so that would be China. How do we square the already organic consumer gravitation to digital currency elsewhere long before central banks or governments get their acts together? So you've touched on this a little bit so far, but it seems, of great concern to many of our listeners that have mentioned similar questions.
Well, as usual, Ambassador Dugan has the best question, and I thank her for it. I would say that she's right. We have been too slow, and China is way in the lead on this issue. Lael Brainerd, Fed governor, former Undersecretary of Treasury in the Obama administration, has been pushing for more movement in this space. So I expect that Janet Yellen and Lael Brainerd are going to really try to make up for some lost time in this space. Now, Jay Powell has been much more cautious on this issue and has, I would say, probably waited longer. And I think that ultimately, I think it really depends upon how Christine Lagarde, Powell, Lael Brainerd, and Yellen team up against China, Ambassador Dugan. I think the United States and the EU, if they are unified on how their central banks and how the Bank of England separately comes out together with the same type of controls and creates a balance against China, that would be my recommendation. And it's that goes with every other China policy. If the United States and the EU can be in lockstep, it's the best barrier against an already disruptive rising China. But we're behind the eight ball a bit. The Europeans and Chinese signed a major trade pact before this administration came in. So there's still time, but that would be my recommendation, Renee, for the EU and the US to team up and to go at this together.
Great, thanks. I know others would recommend that too. So Michael, any final questions? I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions in the chat. There were really some fantastic questions. Michael, I'll hand it to you for the final question and allowing Michael, our guest, to wrap up.
Yeah, I think I could spend the rest of the afternoon talking with Michael and both of you. So, Michael, if you want to make any closing remarks, first and foremost, I want to thank you very much for joining us. Very fortunate to have you. Renee, thank you for co-hosting and help me set this up. Michael, we'd love to have you on campus when things do let up and we can host you in some nice, sunny, warm weather. So I'll leave it with you. But again, thank you very much for joining us and thanks for the great insight.
No, it's my pleasure. Great questions in the chat. And for everyone listening, if any of you are interested in getting involved in any part of this field, you can reach out to Renee and Michael, and I'm happy to follow up with any of you offline. We need your creativity. The United States needs the thinking through your questions to be at the table when we're making these decisions going forward, because what I would leave you with is we've been very effective up to this point. Been very effective using the dollar, using the financial system against our adversaries, but we need to do better. We need to constantly be agile and shift and be creative, because what I observed following terrorist organizations and working against Russia, China, and Iran is that the adversary and the enemy does not rest. The whack-a-mole approach only takes us so far. So the adversary is going to continue to adapt. And just like our Silicon Valley needs to continue to adapt against China's Shenzhen, we need the best and the brightest to go into government and to be inspired about bringing that type of new thinking. So I look forward to working with all of you. Michael and Renee, I accept your offer to come to San Diego. Ambassador Dugan speaks very highly of it. So it's been a real pleasure, and thank you all for having me and for your great questions and great conversation.
Great, thank you, Michael. Just let's see, real
Well,
quick.
learned a lot from your comments. And
Renee, you're muted.
oh, my apologies. So thank you so much, Michael, for being with us today. And thank you for the audience, to the audience for being with us today. Michael can give the closing instructions, but I think we have a hard stop at 1. So again, it's been a great pleasure. Thank you so much, Michael.
Thank you.
Yeah, Michael, thank you very much. And just real quick, for those that have, want to follow up with further questions, either from myself and the Strategic Studies Group, or Renee and her team over at the Center for Commerce and Diplomacy, listed the web link to the center's site there, as well as the email address and the email address for the Strategic Studies Group. So thank you all for joining, and thank you for the very interesting questions. And with that, we'll conclude.